morning everyone. I welcome you again to the NPTEL online course on tribal studies in India, interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches. We have already completed quite a significant lecture or topics on several aspects of tribal studies in India, and today we are going to continue to engage with an attempt to have a better understanding of tribal communities, particularly in the context of the socio-economic transformation of tribes, or sometimes sociologists or anthropologists refer to it as the transformation of tribes. From the time we started with this lecture, one of the things that we tried to really do was to have a very in-depth, perceptive, incisive understanding of tribal societies. And by now we understand that whereas the category tribe or scheduled tribe in India, or even other categories like denotified tribes or particularly vulnerable tribal groups are very helpful classify and categorize populations. But then we also know that these categories are very it can be very homogeneous, in the sense that the communities who are classified as such they are quite diverse, they are very heterogeneous. Now, having said that, when we try to talk about the transformation of tribes also, it is important to bear in mind that we are talking about a transformation of a community who belongs to different regions, who have different cultural, socio-cultural backgrounds, who have a different religious orientation, and the nature of the transformation is also not as simple as it looks. Now, many sociologists and anthropologists particularly have really tried to understand how this transformation is happening in the context of tribal society. Now, this question of transformation of society, or any society for that matter, has been an important part of any sociological or any anthropological work. Now, if you look at key sociological work, maybe by Karl Marx or Durkheim or Max Weber, you will see that one of the things that they tried to really do was to really explain transformation of society from a more traditional society to a very modern industrial society. And in the last from the 19th century and the 20th century onwards, the transformation of society was not only something which was regional or nation specific. Transformation of society was something which was very global in nature. So, every communities are affected by transformation. Now, in that context, sociologists and anthropologists have also really tried to unpack the nature of transformation in society, and today we will try to understand this from two broad perspectives. One is transformation of tribes in relation to what sociologists and anthropologists refer to as the tribe caste continuum, as you can see, which is also the title of our lecture today, and the other is the transformation of tribes as peasants. Now, the understanding of tribal society, as you have seen in the past lectures, you will see that the understanding of tribal society is deeply influenced by the broader context in which anthropologists and sociologists are understanding. Now, in India we know that caste is something which is a very important sociological reality, and therefore many a times the attempt to understand tribe is mostly, or many anthropologists have tried to look at whether tribes what is exactly the difference between tribe and caste. How do we do, are these two different categories? Or if we are saying that one is a caste, one is a tribal communities, then in what ways are they different? Or is it that tribes in India are gradually transforming themselves into castes? Now, these are some of the questions that sociologists and anthropologists were trying to understand, and there are arguments and counter arguments, and many sociologists and anthropologists argue that the transformation definitely is happening, and tribes as a community are not always distinct in the way we thought about the communities. So, today through this lecture we will try to understand the different kind of positions or the different ways in which we can actually understand the tribe caste continuum in the context of India. Now, to start with, the category of ideal tribe and ideal caste may be defined as both a social structure and a cultural pattern. Now, again the coming of the British was very important, where certain communities in India were classified as tribes on the basis of their physical and socio-cultural isolation from caste based Indian society. Now, the predominant social structure in India is definitely caste, but then the Britishers encounter these communities in different parts of India who necessarily are outside the influence of caste system. Now, predominantly these communities, what they have understood is that they are quite distinct socially, culturally and economically. Now, most of them came to be defined as the tribes. Now, even till today, the colonial understanding of tribe, the notion of tribe as a distinct community, tribe as primitive, or tribe as a community who are distinct from the broader Indian society is something which is very very prevalent even till today. Now, but what is more difficult? It is easy to categorize that they are tribe, they are caste, they are not caste and they are therefore tribe. But then what is more difficult, what is more puzzling or intriguing is many social scientists, particularly anthropologists, find it very difficult to decide where tribe ended and where caste began. Now, this resulted into a kind of debate within social science, where there are several anthropologists or sociologists like G.S. Ghurye, who says that there is no real difference between tribal community and and caste. It is just that tribes are gradually, they are already caste, but then it is just that they are not fully integrated into the larger Indian society. Now, there are other anthropologists who have taken a different positions, and then we will look at it over the course of our lecture. So, when early anthropologists examined the position of tribes in India, they found a similar image of a gradual merger with the larger caste system. So, therefore, like I said, G.S. Ghurye, one of the pioneer of Indian sociology, so he was of the contention, he made this contention that tribes does not are not necessarily distinct as we thought. In fact, they are yet to be fully integrated into the larger mainstream society. They are already castes. So, this is the position that and the G.S. Ghurye has taken. Now, two influential scholars which we cannot omit in the discussion of tribes, one is G.S. Ghurye and the other is Verial Irwin. Now, that G.S. Ghurye has devoted his life to the study of Indian communities and was very very instrumental in the shaping of sociology and anthropology in India. On the other hand, Verial Irwin is also a very very known name, whose work and influence continue to be seen in terms of his scholarships on tribes in particular. Now, Irwin, as was came to India as a missionary, and later he trained himself. He wrote extensively about tribal communities, not only in central India but also in northeast India. He have travelled extensively, he lived with the communities, and he was also a strong advocate for the cause of tribal communities. Now, the position of Ghurye and Irwin was not only an academic position. Now, this position also influenced the government policies about tribes, and therefore, it is always very, these two scholars are very important starting point when we try to understand the issue of tribes in the past as well as the present. Now, G.S. Ghurye argued that tribes are not isolated from the Hindu caste in terms of distribution, language, economy and religious tradition, nor are they necessarily the indigenous population of where they reside. So, he labeled tribal groups as backward Hindus, that is, groups that are imperfectly integrated with the caste system. So, Ghurye ruled out the existence of isolated tribes in India. Now, much of Ghurye's work have to do with the tribal communities in central India, and much of the things that he have written about are also mostly in the context of mainland India. Now, one of the main argument that Ghurye has made is that many times we see tribal communities as living in geographically isolated remote places. Now, Ghurye contends that there is this idea of geographical isolation of tribal communities is not entirely true, is not entirely real. Tribal communities have been always in close interaction with the larger Indian society, and today they have this, we have this distinct sense of understanding about tribal communities as different or distinct from the larger Indian societies, primarily because they are imperfectly integrated with the caste system. So, therefore, over a period of time, Ghurye assumes that or believes that tribal communities will transform or integrate themselves fully into the mainstream Indian society. Now, on the other hand, there is Verial Irwin, who viewed tribes as belonging to 4 stages of acculturation. Now, Verial Irwin's position is in total contrast with Ghurye. Now, Verial Irwin look at any tribal communities as a communities in itself. Now, he knows that he, in his work, he has written extensively about the specific way in which tribal communities have a unique distinct culture when one compare or contrast it with the larger Indian society, particularly societies which are organized around caste. Now, Elwin viewed tribes as belonging to 4 stages of acculturation. One is most primitive, who are dependent on X cultivation. Second is the less wild aboriginals. The third is the accultured tribes of the open lowlands, and the fourth is the acculturated tribal aristocrats. Now, when moving from the first category to the third category, socio-economic life of tribal communities become more individualistic and communal art and traditions degenerate. Now, most of the time when we talk about tribal society, we are also some of the common assumptions that we have when we talk about tribal communities is that the society is more communitarian, the society is organized around kinship, the society is more about communal forms of organizing in the sense of for example collective labor or collective land ownership, or many of the social life that we attributed to tribal society is largely in the form of communitarian. Now, Elwin argues, or Elwin notes that when tribal communities transform from the first stage to the second stage to the third stage, now over a period of time these communitarian values within tribal society also begin to wane away, and then more and more individualism or ideas of individualism seep into tribal societies. Now, in the fourth category, however, he says that there is a recovery of order and sophistication among a few landed aristocrat tribals. Now, Elwin classified tribals as uncultured, primitive and marked by ecological isolation, backward food production technology, communal solidarity, traditional social relations, aesthetics and religion. Much of these markers of tribal communities, according to Elwin, continue to be very much prevalent even in our understanding of tribal society or tribal communities in contemporary India. Now, for instance, many times when I raise this question to students in a different settings or in a different forums. If I ask that what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see or hear the term tribe, then students will say that look, tribal communities are primitive, backward, all these things. They may not have read about tribal communities extensively, but then the first impression that comes to mind when one sees or hear the term tribe is some kind of primitive, some kind of backwardness. So there is a strong negative connotations also which is associated with the term tribe. Now, so these features continue to shape our understanding of tribal communities, and many of the things that Elwin have said, for example, isolation, backward food production technology, in the sense that many tribal communities continue to heavily rely on non-mechanized form of economy, in a sense that many of them continue to practice, for instance, zoom cultivation or shifting cultivation, and these are primarily more towards subsistence economy, not always for profit, for instance. And tribal communities are defined by ecological isolation or geographical isolation, which continues to be something which is very, very predominant when one talks about tribes. Now, communal solidarity. So, in the last slide I have explained about the kind of communitarian ethos that most tribal communities practice in terms of their trust, in terms of their customs, in terms of their tradition. Now, even till today the idea of tribal society is closely associated with this idea that they are communities, they are societies which are deeply communitarian, and this communitarian ethos is something which is intrinsic to tribal society. Now, both Gurrier and Elwin approached the subject in terms of an arbitrary cluster of traits without trying to define tribe and caste as two ideal socio-cultural systems. Now, there are many other anthropologists who also try to give their own interpretation of the way in which tribal societies are getting transformed. Now, for Gurrier, the transformation of tribe is essentially towards a caste society, in a sense that the more and more tribal societies come out of their geographical isolation and get into closer contact with the mainstream society, then obviously over a period of time tribes will merge into a caste society, the larger Indian society. That is what that is the position of G.S. Gurrier. Now, on the other hand, Elwin believes that when tribes transform themselves, so the kind of values, the kind of ethos that the communities have begin to go away, and they begin to adopt new cultural values, new ideas such as individualism. Now, some of the other ways in which we can look at this transformation is trying to understand the distinction between tribe and jati. Now, in India, Indian society, all of us know that it is largely grouped into the four Varna system, which consisted of Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Sudras. Now, many anthropologists such as B.K. Roy Burman, a very noted noted anthropologists argue that the Varna system is no longer sufficient to describe all the ethnic classifications and groups, and hence therefore anthropologists like Roy Berman, B.K. Roy Berman specifically tried to advocate the category Jati as something which is more appropriate and something which is more encompassing than Varna. So, Jati did not replace Varna, but it underwent a change where Jati was more frequently used to fit practical purposes, and this helped in understanding the Indian situation better. So, this is the position taken by the anthropologist B.K. Roy Berman. The Jati or the caste system has never been well defined. In many cases during the 18th century, caste has been synonymously used with tribes. Now, in many times it's still very, despite the fact that these categories are used in some way as if they are distinct, but at other times you will also see that many at times they are used synonymously, as if tribe and caste are two not entirely distinct, but two similar categories. So sometimes they are being casually used as if they are synonymous with one another. However, with the rise and growth of nationalism in Europe, tribe came to be denoted as a particular stage of the socio-political evolution of a community of people within a definite territory, language and area. In that light, clan, tribe, nation thus came to denote various progressive stages of such socio-political evolution. In the Indian context, caste was another intermediate stage that was found in the story of such progression. Under these circumstances, the development of Indian sociology and anthropology occurred to understand these categories and their differences. But over a period of time, what happened is that this is also something which we have briefly talked about in our previous lectures, that tribe came to be associated with a particular stage of society, in a sense that which was deeply influenced by evolutionary thinking that came from the advancement in science. For example, from the work of Darwin, who looks at the origins of species in a very evolutionary manner. Now, this evolutionary thinking was also something which deeply influenced anthropology. And when anthropology as a discipline was taking shape, this idea that there are certain communities who are still living in the primitive past, and the belief was that over a period of time they also gradually transform themselves into a modern society. Now, among the communities who are considered to be still living in the primitive past were essentially referred to as tribe. Now, in the case of India also, when we are using the term tribe, we also have this strong sense of evolutionary notion, particularly in terms of the way in which we view and understand tribes as a society which are still primitive and which are still backward. Now, what is the difference between tribal and Jati society? A very important work is by Mandelbaum, who have extensively studied, who have tried to make this distinction between tribal and Jati society. And according to him, the fundamental difference between tribal and caste can be defined in terms of their impersonal relationship. Now, one, tribal life is tribal communities. They are defined in terms of kinship. People belonging to tribal groups were less dependent on each other, and subordination was also minimal. Now, that most tribal societies are organized around kinship, and they tend to be more particularly the idea that tribal society represents a segmentary form of society, where the community is divided into smaller units or segments, right, and they are characterized by features like decentralization of power, right, and there is no centralized power, and the society tends to be more communitarian. The society tends to be more egalitarian because they are not so much organized vertically, in a sense that the society is organized in a more horizontal manner. Agnatic bonds form the key web of relationships, and affinal ties are less significant. In tribal society, lineage or clans tends to be the chief units. Now, even till today, if you look at many, even in 2025, if you look at many tribal societies, particularly if you go to the northeast, you will see that tribal societies, whether they are Khasi, whether they are Naga, whether they are Jaintia, whether they are Mizos, they are largely organized around clans. You are belonging to the clan, you are belonging to the larger lineage is very, very important, and it continues to be organized around clans. Now, what about Jati or caste? Caste members are organized hierarchically in society, that is in contrast to the tribal society, who are more organized in a more horizontal manner, but in the case of caste society, they are more organized in a vertical manner. Kinship cannot be the only unit for social relationship in this system. this system is more unequal when one compares with the tribal society, and instead of minimizing dependency, they emphasize and try to prolong the dependency on other families. In terms of religious structures, tribal focus on both short-term pragmatic functions of religion as well as the long-term transcendental functions, as they do not differentiate between two aspects. But in the case of caste society, people focus more on transcendental functions. Now, beyond that, one of the simple way in which we can make a distinction between religion in tribal society and religion in caste society is that most of the nature of beliefs in tribal society, they don't necessarily rely on scriptures. For instance, they are more into myths, they are more into they are more, the belief revolves around narrating stories of migration, for instance. So it is mostly rooted in the oral culture, or the oral culture is part of constitute the larger belief system in tribal societies as well. But if you look at most communities who are under the caste system, then you will see that they rely more on scriptures, right. So this kind of differences exist between a tribal society and caste society. Now, Mandelbaum argues that tribals take direct and unfiltered satisfaction in the pleasure of senses, there is food culture, but jatis are inclined to form the concept of purity and pollution around such activities. Now, so this is also one important distinction. In the context of caste, the idea of purity and pollution is still something which is very, very strong, whereas in the context of tribe, that is not so much the case in terms of sharing food, sharing public space, sharing private space, so on and so forth. Despite such differences, there are certain similar features of jati and tribe. In both the social categories, the members consider their groups to be endogamous entities and are ritual equal to each other. Now, in the context of tribal society, you will see that the horizontal notion in terms of that each member of the communities are equal or more or less equal is very, very strong. Now, in the case of the society, it is very clear, because it is ordered hierarchically, and therefore there is a strong sense of hierarchy in the sense that you already know that who is higher and who is lower and who is at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. Now, another important scholar that I wanted to quickly talk about is F.G. Bailey, who has made a significant contribution in terms of trying to understand the difference between tribe and caste. Now, Bailey makes a systematic analysis and argues that caste society is organic, whereas tribal society is segmentary. Now, in this case, organic refers to a highly interdependent structure where different groups perform specific roles. On the contrary, segmentary refers to self-sufficient groupings. Now, in the case of caste, like I said, many of caste groups are also linked to occupation, right. Now, specific caste groups perform different kinds of occupation. Now, in the case, and then so therefore the system is also quite the different caste groups in the order hierarchy are quite interlinked in a sense that all of them have to perform different set of roles and different sets of responsibilities within the caste hierarchy. Now, in the context of tribes, you will see that the society is more segmentary in a sense that it is divided into different segments, but then all these segments are also interlinked, but not necessarily in a hierarchical manner. Caste and tribe are opposite ends of a single line. Societies are located at different points along this line. So that is a different kind of continuum that Bailey is talking about, that not necessarily as they are entirely different, but they are opposite ends of a single line. Societies with greater access to land are closer to tribal end of the continuum, while societies with land rights dependent on relationships are nearer to the caste end. Tribe is a system of social relations as well as a state of mind and cultural tradition characterized by isolation and lack of stratification. Now, this is also something that characterizes tribal society. So, for instance, it is most tribal societies prefer or continue to live in isolation, probably out of their own choice, and there is less stratification as compared to caste society. Now, Surajit Sinha expanded this continuum by providing a new characterization: tribe, caste, and tribe peasant. This polarity of the continuum was based on Redfield's concept of the folk-urban continuum and peasant society and culture. So, basically Surajit Sinha draws this idea of tribe, caste and tribe peasant continuum from the work of Redfield's folk-urban continuum and peasant society and culture. Now, according to Sinha, the tribal end is marked by demographic, social structures and in-group sentiment, with tribes remaining isolated in various aspects including ecology, economy, politics and social relations. Such homogeneity manifests in cultural traits autonomous from others and disconnected from the great traditions of Indian civilization in terms of equality, closeness to natural and supernatural, ethical religion and puritanical asceticism. So, an important characteristics that we have talked about constantly is the idea of communitarian values in tribal society. So, therefore, Surajit Sinha also notes that one important feature about tribal societies, there is a very strong in group sentiment, in a sense that because the communities are so much interdependent and there is more of a privilege of communitarian ideas within the community, and therefore there is this some sense of insularity that Sinha observed in the case of tribal society. And most of the time tribal societies or tribal communities tends to be very homogeneous, in a sense that there will be only one clan, there will be only few clans who are inhabiting a particular geography, inhabiting a particular village. So, unlike many other villages or regional settings in India, you will see that most tribal habitats tends to be quite homogeneous in terms of their composition. Now, on the other hand, the caste N is typically connected, heterogeneous and stratified with occupational specialization, multi-ethnic residence, stratified land tenure and interdependent out-group interactions. Now, like I said many a times caste is definitely an identity, but then there is a strong link between caste and occupation as well. So, therefore, as Sinha pointed out, one thing that characterizes one marker of caste is the occupational specialization within the hierarchy, and multi-ethnic residence, in the sense that there are different caste groups who live maybe in a single village or within a larger regional setting. Now, land ownership is quite stratified or it can be very skewed, but if you look at most tribal society, you will see that even land ownership is quite communitarian, in the sense that even this is not to say that there is no private land ownership, but most of the times the land ownership system in tribal communities tend to follow a very what we sometimes call it as the communal land holding system. So, lands are particularly fields, mountains, hills, which are used for cultivations, are not necessarily owned by any single individual. So, there is this sense of communal land holding systems in most tribal societies even till today, which is quite distinct when one looks at caste society. The cultural features of the caste pole involve interaction with the great tradition, polarization of common and elite cultures, hierarchical social relations, the concept of ritual pollution and a puritanical view of life. So, therefore, it is the opposite end of tribal society, in a sense that there is far more interaction with the great traditions, and there is clear hierarchy, clear distinctions between the caste groups within caste society. So, these features according to Bailey, F.G. Bailey, marks some kind of distinction, the way in which we can distinguish tribe and society, the various markers that distinguish between these two society. Now, for a multi-caste peasant role, all the features of caste society are applicable. In addition to that, it is marked by territorial affiliations to a diverse network of relationship, heterogeneous internal division into caste, class groups and specialized centers of cultural nucleation. Thus, a movement from isolated tribal pole to caste and peasant involves a progression towards ethnic and cultural heterogeneity, role specialization, social stratification, diversification of territorial network and further systematization of cultural ideals along the great traditions. Now, for instance, if a tribal community transform themselves or integrate themselves into the larger caste society, it means that the society also is moving towards a more heterogeneous kind of society. There is far more complex division of labor in terms of role specialization. Social stratification is becoming more evident, in a sense that maybe the social stratification in terms of income, in terms of occupations, diversification of territorial network and further systematization of cultural ideals along with the great traditions. So, this is the argument of F.G. Bailey. Now, through this presentation, what we have tried to do is we try to really understand the difference, the nature of transformation and the kind of debates that took place particularly from the 60s, the 70s and the 80s onwards. Now, the idea essentially is that in India we have used and applied different categories, and one of the most prominent categories that definitely sociologists and anthropologists have to contend with and still trying to understand is, for instance, the issue of caste. Now, definitely caste provides an important lens to understand Indian society, and however, there are many other communities in India who are outside of the caste system, and this is far more prominent in regions like Northeast India. where many tribal communities have their own distinct culture, their own distinct sense of identity, language, belief systems, histories, so on and so forth. Now, one of the issue that anthropologists and sociologists have tried to really understand is where is it that tribes are gradually transforming themselves into castes, or if not, what are the ways in which you can clearly identify or distinguish between these two categories, tribe and caste. Is there a difference, and if there is a difference, and what is the difference? But many sociologists and anthropologists for a long time maintain a position that over a period of time tribes are gradually integrating themselves into caste society. Now, this may be true in many parts of India today, in a sense that there is no community who are entirely isolated. All communities are getting exposed. There is far more intermixing of populations with urbanization, industrialization, so on and so forth. Many tribal communities have migrated out of their homelands as well. They are migrated out of their villages, getting exposed to different cultures. Now, in that kind of context, whether the transformation is necessarily moving towards a caste society is still something that needs to be closely studied. But then some of the questions that the anthropologists and sociologists are asking themselves, what is the nature of this transformation that is taking in tribal society? Is it that when tribals are being exposed to different kind of cultural setting, different kind of economic setting, is it that they are adapting or adjusting or absorbed into the larger Indian society, or is it that they are capable of maintaining their own distinct society? These are some of the things that continues to be debated in the particularly in the disciplines like sociology and anthropology. And in the next lecture we will continue with trying to understand the nature of transformation in tribal society, particularly the transformation of tribe as peasant. Thank you so much.